Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhaso and we'll be looking at another discourse of the Buddha. This one is from the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 22, sutta number 85. So I'll start with paying homage to the Buddha and then I'll read through the discourse and give some explanations. And if there's any questions, I'll answer them at the end. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So, as mentioned, this is Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 22, sutta number 85, which is here called the Yamaka Sutta. So it's a discourse to a monk named Yamaka. So I'll start reading through the sutta and give some explanations. At one time, Venerable Sariputta was staying near Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's monastery. At that time, a mendicant named Yamaka had the following harmful misconception. So he thought, as I understand the Buddhist teachings, a mendicant who has ended the defilements is annihilated and destroyed when their body breaks up, and they do not exist after death. So clearly wrong view, clearly not in accordance with the Buddhist teachings. The sutta goes on. So several other mendicants heard about this, and they went to Yamaka, exchanged greetings with him, and then sat down to one side and said to him, "Is it really true, Venerable Yamaka, that you have such a harmful misconception? That, as you understand the Buddhist teachings, a mendicant who has ended their defilements is annihilated and destroyed when their body breaks up and does not exist after death?" And Yamaka confirms, he says, "Yes, that's how I understand the Buddhist teachings." And the other monks reply, "Don't say that, Yamaka. Do not misrepresent the Buddha, for it is not good to misrepresent the Buddha, and the Buddha would not say that." But even though he was admonished by the other mendicants, Yamaka obstinately stuck to that misconception and insisted on stating it. So when those mendicants were unable to dissuade Yamaka from that misconception, they got up from their seats and went to see Venerable Sariputta. They told him what had happened and said, "May Venerable Sariputta please go to the mendicant Yamaka out of sympathy." And Sariputta consented silently. So just to say a little bit about this so far, so here we have a setup which we find in a few places in the suttas where someone, usually one of the bhikkhus, one of the monastic disciples of the Buddha, or one of them has a wrong view, some kind of misunderstanding of the Dhamma. And even when the other monks tell them that their understanding is incorrect, that their view is wrong, then the monk keeps holding to their view. And then usually what happens is either they get the Buddha himself to come and correct the person's misunderstanding, or they get one of the senior disciples of the Buddha to come and try to teach the Dhamma to the person with a wrong view. So in this case, the wrong view that this person had was the wrong view that when a fully enlightened person, so an arhat or a Buddha, when a fully enlightened person passes away, so when their body dies, they believe that a fully enlightened person ceases to exist when their body dies. So this is actually not a wrong view only of Venerable Yamaka 2,500 years ago. It continues to be an extremely common wrong view among Buddhists, even to this day. So particularly in Theravada Buddhism, there's a lot of people who believe that when a fully enlightened person, when their body dies, that person ceases to exist. A lot of people believe that nibbana means non-existence, that it means ceasing to exist. But this is not what the Buddha taught. It's not an accurate understanding. And that's what's being targeted at here. So Yamaka had the belief that a fully awakened being ceases to exist when they die, and the other monks were telling him, no, that's not correct. But since he wouldn't listen, since they couldn't convince him, then they went to get Venerable Sariputta. So Venerable Sariputta was one of the Buddha's two foremost disciples in wisdom. The other one being the Bhikkhuni Khema, the Arhat Bhikkhuni Khema, who was said in the suttas to be the equal of Sariputta in wisdom. Though we have many more discourses involving Sariputta than involving the Arhat Khema, but she was said to be his equal in wisdom. And of course the two chief disciples were the Bhikkhu Mahamoggallana and the Bhikkhuni Uplavanna, who were the foremost in psychic powers, but they don't factor into this discourse. So again, the other monks go to Venerable Sariputta and ask him to help. And it says Sariputta consented silently. And just a minor translation point here, which is, so the line here is Adiva Sesi Tunhi Bhavena. So Tunhi Bhavena means with silence, or in silence, or silently. So they consented silently. This doesn't necessarily mean that silence itself is consent, but rather it means that consent was given without using words. So for example, nodding would be consenting silently, or making some physical gesture of agreement would count as consenting silently. So this is a small point, but it has some relevance because people sometimes think that if a monk is just silent and doesn't say anything, then that automatically means they agree. But that's actually not correct. That'd be another misconception, and unfortunately we couldn't get Sariputta to come and correct it. We'd have to correct it ourselves. So the sutta continues. So then in the afternoon, Venerable Sariputta came out of retreat, went to Venerable Yamaka and exchanged greetings with him. Seated to one side, he said to Yamaka, "Is it really true, Venerable Yamaka, that you have such a harmful misconception? As you understand the Buddha's teachings, a monk who has ended the defilements is annihilated and destroyed when their body breaks up and does not exist after death?" And Yamaka confirms. He says, "Yes, Venerable, that's how I understand the Buddha's teachings." So again, it's quite clear here that Venerable Yamaka really did sincerely believe what he was saying, since even when spoken to by many other monks and even by one of the two foremost disciples in wisdom, he still really held to this. Like, this is actually what I think. And again, this is not uncommon. So even these days, I've met many Theravada Buddhists and even Theravada Buddhist monks who hold this wrong view. So it's still common even to this day. So then Venerable Sariputta starts questioning Yamaka. So asking Yamaka a series of questions. He says, "What do you think, Yamaka? Is the body permanent or impermanent?" So this is Rupang Nichang Va Anichang Va. So Rupa means physical body, or physical form in general, material form in general. But commonly in a set here, which is the set of the five khandhas, it's referring to one's own body, one's own physical body. And he's saying, is it nicca or anicca? So nicca means persistent or stable, and therefore anicca means non-persistent or non-stable. So it's commonly translated as permanent or impermanent, as it is here. But it's important to understand that nicca does not necessarily mean permanent in the sense of something that lasts forever. But what it rather means is persistent or ongoing or stable in the sense of something that seems to have some kind of lasting, unchanging existence. So it could be finite, like something seems to be stable and persistent for 5 minutes or 5 years, then that would be nicca for 5 minutes or 5 years. So anicca is saying that nothing is persistent. Nothing has any lasting stability or unchanging reality at all. So in this case, he's asking Yamaka, like, so regarding your physical body, your experience of physical sensation through the body, is that persistent and stable? In other words, is your experience of your body always exactly the same, moment to moment? Or is it non-persistent? Is it unstable? Is it changing moment to moment? So rupang nichang va anichang va. Is your physical experience persistent, stable, or is it non-persistent, non-stable, constantly changing? And Yamaka replies, anicca. He replies, yes, it's non-persistent, it's unstable, it is changing, it is anicca. So then Sai Buddha says, Vedana anicca, Sanya anicca, Sankhara anicca, Vijnanang nichang va anicchang va. So for each of the five khandhas, he asks the same question. So first for the physical body, and then for Vedana. So Vedana is feeling or sensation. And in particular, it's the experience of pleasure, pain, or neutrality. Pleasant sensation, painful sensation, or neutral sensation. So asking again, is that persistent or non-persistent? So for example, if right now you're experiencing a painful sensation in the body, or a painful emotion in the mind, is that persistent? Does it remain exactly the same and unchanging for an extended period of time? Or is it non-persistent? Is it subject to change? So maybe you're experiencing a lot of pain in your left knee, but then a few seconds later, you're experiencing only moderate pain in your left knee. And now you're experiencing severe pain in your right knee. Well, that's anicca. It's changing. It's not the same. Or maybe right now, the sense of tormented agitation in your heart is a ranking 9.9 out of 10. But then the next moment, it goes all the way down to 9.8 out of 10. That's non-persistent. It's not stable. It's subject to change. So watching our Vedana and seeing how it's always shifting and changing. Or you're having a pleasant experience, and that also goes up and down, arises and ceases. It shifts and changes moment to moment. And also neutrality is the same. Maybe you're in a neutral state, not particularly pleasant or painful. And then that changes too. That changes character moment by moment as well. So noticing like, oh, okay, yeah, also our experience of feeling, of sensation, of Vedana is also non-persistent. It's also changing. Then the next one is sanya. Sanya is commonly translated as perception, though the actual meaning is a bit closer to recognition or identification. So sanya is the mental process in which we identify our experiences. So we receive, for example, a packet of visual information through our eyes. And then the mind is like, well, what is this? And it's like, oh, I think this visual information represents a tree. And at the base of the tree, there's a bunch of green grass. Above the tree, there's blue sky with a shining sun with a bird flying through it. The kind of tree is a Bodhi tree. So that's all sanya. Sanya is taking the raw sensory data and then placing an identity on it, giving a conceptualization to it. So some of this is based on memory, and in fact the word sanya also has the meaning of memory in some contexts. So our memory of past experiences helps us to identify our current experiences. And some of it is just based on the current experience. We analyze the current experience and we try to figure out what's going on. So that's the identification process of sanya. And what's interesting about sanya is that it can change. First of all, it's not always accurate. In fact, if you're unawakened, it's mostly inaccurate. But also it can change. A classic example of this, which many people may have had, is if an object comes into your peripheral vision. So at the very edge of your peripheral vision, your visual acuity is quite weak. So when an object comes into the field, the peripheral edge of your field of vision, then the mind will tend to immediately start guessing what it's seeing. And once it guesses what it's seeing, it will actually fill in an image of what it's expecting. So a common example of this is you might see some motion coming in out of the corner of your eye, and the mind thinks, oh, that's a cat. And it will actually project the image of a cat into the corner of your field of vision. And then you turn and look, and you're like, oh, that's actually not a cat, that's a raccoon. Or that's a little dog, or it's a squirrel, or it's something other than what you initially thought it was. So this is also why sanya is something very interesting to investigate, very interesting to explore, because we're actually constantly making automatic subconscious assumptions about what we're experiencing and then pasting that onto our experience. So we're constantly assuming that we know what's going on and then projecting our assumption onto our sensory field. So one element of Buddhist practice is learning how to identify the raw sensation prior to sanya being pasted on top of that experience, prior to sanya altering or reinterpreting the experience. And often what we discover is that our sanya process is a little bit off. It's a little bit wrong. It's distorting or altering our experience in ways that are confusing or unhelpful. So sanya, observing how our internal identification and recognition process is also not persistent. It's also constantly changing, also subject to change. And the next one is sankhara, which is translated incorrectly here. So if you're following along, I'm reading here from Bhante Sujata's translation, and sankhara, the word sankhara, depending on the context, it can have a few different meanings, but in the context of the five khandhas, it's referring to mental activities and mental phenomena, mental objects, which includes a wide range of different things that we experience through the mind. So sankharas can include active thinking. For example, if you're telling yourself a story in your mind, as most people spend a fair amount of their time doing, then that's sankhara. It can also include objects appearing in the mind. So for example, maybe you're sitting here and a memory of the past arises in the mind. Well, that's also a sankhara. It's not something that you're choosing to create in that moment, but it's something that is appearing in the mind. It's a mental object, a mental phenomenon. So then sankhara is mental activities, but also mental objects, things which are known directly through the mind and not through the body. And so mental activities and objects are also unstable, impersistent, constantly changing. In fact, this is something which is very interesting to observe during meditation practice, where you don't really have much to do except watch your mind. Is you can watch how the mind is constantly changing. The objects and activities of mind are constantly changing. Thoughts and emotions are constantly changing. Memories appearing and vanishing. Memories also changing. Something interesting is sometimes a memory will arise and you'll realize that your memory of the memory is different. It's like, oh, that's interesting. You might realize, like, oh, I used to remember this event differently. Something's changed. That also can be interesting to observe. Or again, if you're having some thought pattern or emotional experience, well, rather than fixate on the content of it, pay attention to the changing of it. Noticing how that emotion is in a constant state of flux. Or noticing how those thought patterns are also shifting and changing. So paying attention to the changingness of it helps us to see that that's not actually ultimately who we are. It's just another temporary experience passing through the mind. So then that makes it easier to see, oh, this is not me. This is not who I am. So then the fifth one is vijnana, which is commonly translated consciousness. So that's the faculty of awareness of a sensory domain. This is how it's used in most places in the suttas anyway. Is it refers to awareness of, for example, the visual domain, or awareness of the auditory domain. So awareness of a sensory domain. And that, of course, is also non-persistent. That also is constantly changing. And watching that constant change starts to break down, starts to dismantle the sense of self that we have in relationship to sensory perceptions and sensory experiences. So again, he asks, is consciousness persistent or non-persistent? Anicca or anicca? And Venerable Yamaka replies, anicca. And at this point, the text is elided. So I'm going to see if I can find the full text. No, it's elided here as well. But this appears to be an elision from the Anattalakkhana Sutta, where the Buddha then goes on to say, seeing in this way, seeing the impermanent nature of the five khandhas, the impermanent nature of every aspect of body and mind, then one becomes disenchanted with body and mind, the five khandhas. One becomes dispassionate towards them, and one clearly sees, this is not me, this is not mine, this is not who I am. So, netang mama neso hamasmi nameso attati, like this is not mine, this is not me, this is not who I am. And seeing in this way, then one attains full awakening. One is completely free from the cycle of confused, delusional suffering, rebirth. So starting with the recognition of the non-persistent, constantly changing nature of every aspect of body and mind, then one recognizes, oh, since this is constantly changing, since it's not persistent, then it cannot possibly be me. It cannot possibly be who I am. And this reflection also is something that can be really useful whenever one is having a particularly painful or challenging experience, is one can look at it, notice its non-persistent nature, its constantly changing nature, and one can remind oneself, this is not me. This is not who I am. This does not belong to me. This does not control me. This does not define me. So if there's a painful emotion, for example, one can pay attention to it and say, this is not me. This is not mine. This is not who I am. This does not define me. This does not control me. It's just another temporary experience passing through awareness. That's all. So, then Venerable Sariputta continues his questioning to Venerable Yamaka. He says, what do you think? Do you regard the Tathagata as the body? So this is Rupang Tathagatoti Samanupassasi. So do you see the Tathagata? So the Tathagata is the awakened one, commonly a title for the Buddha, but it can also be applied to other arhats. So do you think that the Tathagata is his body? Do you think the Buddha is defined by his physical body? And Yamaka replies, certainly not, Venerable. And then Sariputta says, do you see the Tathagata as feeling, as his Vedana? It's like, certainly not. Yes, well, do you see the Tathagata as his perception, sanya? Do you see him as his mental activities and objects, sankhara? Do you see the Tathagata as his consciousness, his sensory awareness, vijnana? And for each one, Yamaka says, no, Bhante, certainly not. And then he asks a different set of questions. He says, do you regard the Tathagata as in the body? So a being that exists inside the physical body. He says, no, Bhante, certainly not. He says, well, then do you regard the Tathagata as something separate from the body, something other than the body? He says, certainly not. And then he asks the same series of questions for each of the 5 khandas. So for each one asking, do you see the Buddha, the Tathagata, the fully awakened one, do you see them as the body, as in the body, or as separate from the body? And for each one he says no. And then the same, do you see them as feeling, in feeling, or separate from feeling? And each one, no. And same for perception, mental activities, and consciousness. And for each one he says no, certainly not. And then he says, do you regard the Tathagata as possessing physical form, feeling, perception, mental activities, and consciousness? And he says, no, Bhante. He says, well, then do you see the Tathagata as one who is without physical form, feeling, perception, mental activities, and consciousness? And Yamaka replies, no, Venerable Sir. And then Sariputta replies. He says, in that case, Venerable Yamaka, since you can't actually find the Tathagata in this very life, is it appropriate to declare, as I understand the Buddha's teaching, a mendicant who has ended defilements is annihilated and destroyed when their body breaks up and does not exist after death? So in other words, what Sariputta is saying here is he's saying that since even while an awakened being is in front of you, you cannot say that they are their body. You cannot define them as existing inside their body, but you also cannot say that there's something completely separate and distinct from the body. So you already cannot identify, you cannot tie them to anything physical or to any of the other 4 khandas. So then how can you then make some proclamation about what happens to them when their body dies? If you already cannot identify a relationship with their body, then when the body dies, how can you say what happens to them then? Or if anything can be said to happen to them then? And fortunately, Venerable Yamaka gets the point. He replies, Venerable Sariputta, in my ignorance, I used to have that misconception. But now that I've heard the teaching from Venerable Sariputta, I have given up that misconception and I have comprehended the teaching. So this is good. The point got through. So then Sariputta says, Venerable Yamaka, suppose they were to ask you, when their body breaks up after death, what happens to an arhat who has ended the defilements? How would you answer? And Yamaka replies, if they were to ask this, I would answer, form, so the physical form, is impermanent. What is impermanent is unsatisfying. What is unsatisfying has ceased and ended. Feeling is impermanent. What is impermanent is unsatisfying. And what is unsatisfying has ceased and ended. And so through for each of the 5 khandas, for perception, mental activities, and consciousness. And he says, that's how I would answer such a question. So in other words, what this is saying is rather than talk about an awakened being as something which exists or doesn't exist before or after death, instead of just looking to see what can we actually say, we can see the arising and ceasing of physical experiences, the rising and ceasing of mental experiences, the arising and ceasing of dukkha, of suffering. And we can see that in an awakened being, all suffering has come to an end. This is what we can clearly see. And then Sariputta gives a simile. He says, good, Venerable Yamaka. And he says, I shall give you a simile to make the meaning even clearer. Suppose there was a householder or householder's child who was rich, with a lot of money and great wealth and a bodyguard for protection. Then along comes a person who wants to harm, injure, and threaten him and take his life. And they would think, This householder or householder's child is rich, with a lot of money and great wealth, and a bodyguard for protection. It will not be easy to take his life by force. Why don't I get close to him, then take his life? So he goes to that householder or householder's child and says, Sir, I would serve you. And they would serve that householder or householder's child. They would get up before him and go to bed after him, and be obliging, behaving nicely and speaking politely. The householder or householder's child would consider them as a friend and companion, and come to trust them. But when that person realizes that they've gained the trust of the householder or householder's child, then when they know he's alone, they would take his life with a sharp knife. Sariputta says, what do you think, Yamaka? When that person went to the householder or householder's son and offered to serve him, weren't they a killer then? Although he did not know yet that this was his killer? And when they got up before him and went to bed after him, being obliging, behaving nicely and speaking politely, weren't they a killer then, though he did not know that this was his killer? And then, knowing he was alone, they took his life with a sharp knife. Weren't they a killer then, although he did not know that this was his killer? And Yamaka replies, yes, Venerable. And Sariputta explains the meaning of the metaphor. He says, in the same way, an unlearned, ordinary person who has not seen the noble ones and is neither skilled nor trained in the teaching of the noble ones, has not seen good people and is neither skilled nor trained in the teaching of good people. They regard the body as self, self as having the body, body as in self, or self as in body. They regard feeling as self, self as having feeling, feeling as in self, or self as in feeling. They regard perception as self, self as having perception, perception in self, or self in perception. They regard mental activities as self, self as having mental activities in self, or self in mental activities. They regard consciousness as self, or self as having consciousness, consciousness as in self, or self as in consciousness. They do not truly understand the physical body, feeling, perception, mental activities, and consciousness, which are impermanent, as impermanent. They do not understand that the physical body, feeling, perception, mental activities, and consciousness, which are unsatisfying, as unsatisfying. They do not truly understand physical body, feeling, perceptions, mental activities, and consciousness, which are not self. They do not understand them as not self. They do not understand body, feeling, perceptions, mental activities, and consciousness, all of which are conditioned, as conditioned. They do not understand body, feeling, perception, mental activities, and consciousness, which are killers, as killers. They're attracted to the body, feeling, perception, mental activities, and consciousness. They grasp them and commit to the thought, this is myself. And when you've gotten involved with and grasped these 5 aggregates of grasping, they lead to your lasting harm and suffering. So here Venerable Sariputta is given a way of understanding. So he gives the example of the person who seems trustworthy and reliable and helpful, who offers to come and be your servant. But then eventually, they kill you. Eventually you realize they've been deceiving you all along, that they weren't here to help you, it was just here to harm you. So in the same way, we have these 5 khandhas, these 5 components of being. So our physical body, our feelings, our perceptions, our mental activities, and our consciousness. And that's actually not the problem. The problem is that when we take these as me, so mental activities, we see mental activities and we think, this is me, this is who I am. In that moment, then we give them the power. They give them power to harm us. That's when one is giving them the ability to inflict suffering on us. So the body is the body. The body is not in and of itself capable of tormenting us. Feelings are not capable of tormenting us. Perceptions are not capable of tormenting us. Mental activities are not capable of tormenting us. Consciousness is not capable of tormenting us. It is only when we see these things, when we see physical sensations and mental activities and the rest of it, it's when we see them as, oh, this is me, or this belongs to me, or this is in me, or this is happening in me, or I am happening in these things. That's when we give them power. That's when we give them the power to cause suffering for us. But if we clearly see, oh, this is not me, this is not mine, this is not who I am, then they have no power over us. So then this is what Venerable Sariputta says next. He says, a learned disciple of the noble ones, one who has seen the noble ones, who is skilled in training in the teaching of the noble ones, who has seen good people, who is skilled and trained in the teaching of good people. They do not regard the body as self, the self as having a body, body as in self, or self as in body. And the same for the other khandhas. They understand the 5 khandhas as impermanent, as unsatisfying, as not self, as conditioned, and as killers. So not being attracted to the 5 khandhas, they do not grasp at them, and they do not commit to the thought, this is myself. And he says, when you're not attracted to and do not grasp at these 5 aggregates of grasping, these 5 khandhas, then that leads to your lasting welfare and happiness. So again, we have these 5 khandhas. They're here. We have the experience of body and mind. So that's not the problem. The problem is when we latch onto it. So thinking these 5 khandhas are me, or these 5 khandhas are owned by me, or these 5 khandhas are in me, or I am in these 5 khandhas. When we take them personally, when we form a self-identity around them, any kind of mental activities or physical experiences, whenever we build a self-identity around it, whenever we take it personally, whenever we think this is me, this is mine, this is who I am, this defines me, in that moment, then we suffer. But the moment when we recognize that every aspect of body and mind, whatever mental experience is happening, whatever physical experience is happening, when we recognize, oh, this is not persistent, this is not stable, this is not who I am, this is not something that defines or controls me, then in that moment, then there's no longer suffering. In that moment, the suffering evaporates. The 5 khandhas are still there, but the dukkha evaporates. So this is what defines a fully awakened being. It's not about whether the 5 khandhas are present or not, but it's that because there is no self-identity in relationship to the 5 khandhas, then there is no suffering. And then the story has a happy ending. Venerable Yamaka says, Venerable Sariputta, this is how it is when you have such venerables as spiritual companions to advise and instruct you out of kindness and sympathy. And after hearing this teaching by Venerable Sariputta, my mind is freed from the defilements by not grasping. So at the end of the discourse, Venerable Yamaka took to heart Sariputta's message, changed his attitude, changed his perception, and was able to see that, yes, in fact, these physical sensations, mental activities are in fact not me, not mine, not who I am, and therefore not suffering. So we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then I'll see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So hello to the people joining in online. Hello to Elenisa, Vanessa. We just saw both of you at the monastery a few days ago. It's good. And Manal, Jewel, Sud, Brian, Jayanta, Kim, Poka, Bhumika, Lydia, Maria, Janaki, Mr. Yong, Moon, Victoria, and anybody else who is joining in. It's good to see all of you. And I see a couple questions here. Sud says, Does seeing that all this is not self, does this happen in the middle of meditation after one attains to concentration akin to jhanas? It can, but it can happen in any moment. So the recognition of non-self, anatta sanya, is something that you can practice at all times. So you don't need to wait until you're in jhana. In fact, often one of the ways to start clearing away the hindrances to samadhi is to see them as impermanent and non-self. So whatever current tormenting activity is going on in the mind, we see, oh, this is not persistent, it's not stable, it's constantly changing. Oh, this is not who I am, this is not me, this is not mine, this doesn't define me. So we see it as impersonal, we see it as impersistent and impersonal. And when we do that, then it stops bothering us. And then the mind is able to settle down and enter a stable, collected state of samadhi. And then it's possible to apply this perception on a deeper level. But even when you're out walking around, you can still apply the perception of non-self. Just whatever experience is currently happening, you remind yourself, this is not me, this is not mine, this is not who I am, this is not personal, this is just a function of nature, this is just nature expressing itself. So you can apply the perception of not self at all times. You don't have to wait until jhana. And Sud says, how are these 5 khandhas causing suffering? Is it because they lead to further future existence and rebirth? Well, there's that, but generally speaking, you don't have to look so far in the future. Just look in the present moment. When there is attachment and identification in relationship to the 5 khandhas, then there is dukkha. You can see it in your own mind. Whenever there's, oh, I want this and I don't want that, then there is suffering. Some sensation happens in the body or the mind and you're like, oh, I want this to go away. Well, that's suffering. Wanting it to go away is suffering. The experience itself is not suffering. Wanting it to go away is suffering. Or something happens and you think, oh, this is who I am. Well, that's suffering. Not the sensation itself, not the thought or the emotion itself, but labeling it as me. That's what makes it painful. That's what makes it uncomfortable, is attaching the self-identity to the experience. And that does, of course, lead to further existence and rebirth in the future as well. Because the impetus for rebirth is self-identity. And Victoria says, why is waking up before someone and going to sleep after them a sign of respect in the suttas? Is it simply so you can be available to assist someone, or is it more than that? I think it's just that. It's just so that the point being is that you're always there to assist them and help them. So when the master wakes up in the morning, then the servant is already awake and ready to help. And the servant is with them all day long, always looking for ways to help. And only after the master has gone to sleep, only then does the servant retire for the night. So it's just the idea of being constantly available for as long as the person is awake. In the same way that our 5 khandhas are constantly available. As long as we're awake, we're constantly having body and mind. But if we relate to it incorrectly, if we relate to it as self, then it causes us suffering, just like the treacherous servant. So TJ says, in what way is emptiness related to interdependence and dependent origination? That's a little off topic because this sutta didn't actually go into Paticca Samuppada at all. So TJ, I would recommend bringing this question to Monk Chat on Friday evening. That would be a great time for this one. Similar, Bupos has a question about the Chula Sunyata Sutta, great sutta, but not the one we're talking about tonight. We could maybe put it on the list. That's a fun one. And advice for deeper abiding in the sense of infinite space. Again, not on the topic of this sutta. Good question, but not on this sutta. So, Bupos, you could bring that question to Mug Chat Friday evening. And that's the last question online. So if there's nothing else, we can go ahead and conclude at this time. Brooke says, can you quickly summarize the sutta? If you had to sum it up, could you? And briefly, see all physical and mental activities and sensations as constantly changing and impersonal. And if you do so, then you will not suffer. That's the main point of the sutta. Okay. So we can go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. If there's any more questions, you can bring them to Mug Chat on Friday evening. So we'll see you next time.